Welcome to Talkin' Ship, the Venture Asheville podcast, where we talk about issues and topics in entrepreneurship. If you're looking for a podcast on schooners, frigates, catamarans, dinghies, pontoons, or runabouts, you're in the wrong place. If you want to talk about startups, tech, Asheville, and entrepreneurship, well, that's my ship, and this ship is a-sailin'. Venture Asheville is the high-growth entrepreneurship initiative of the Economic Development Coalition for Asheville-Buncombe County. We build entrepreneurs and get startups funded. I'm Jeffrey Kaplan, the director of Venture Asheville and lover of calico cats. With me is the wonderful, smart, talented, considerate, and creative Juliana Walker, our master of interactive media. Juliana, what's good?
It's been a weird day, but it's going to get better now that I'm in here. Yeah.
And it's Friday.
It's Friday.
This is do you have any big plans for the weekend?
I don't. I'm thinking about tubing down the French Broad, though. Might get sunburnt. Might be muddy, might be gross, but it's an Asheville thing, so I'm going to try it out.
Also, Downtown After 5 is back tonight. So first Downtown After 5.
Maybe I'll check that out.
Look at us, cutting up like a couple of old friends.
Cutting it up. Wow.
So this is actually our first podcast episode. This is a dream of mine for years to start a podcast. And for our first episode, we're going to talk about podcasting. Juliana, podcasts, are these still cool?
I think so. I listen to podcasts every day. So if it's cool to me, it's cool to everybody. So it's just the rule.
That's why we hired you here as our interactive media marketing person. Are you a Gen Zer?
I'm a Gen Z millennial cusp, 96.
Okay. So you're definitely with the culture.
Yes, with the culture on the TikToks. So
then I'm glad we're podcasting together. To help us with this episode, and guidance on how to get this podcast off to a good start, I've invited some really good friends to talk shop today. With us are Ash famous podcasters. I think I created a term, Ash famous.
That's I like it a lot.
Like local Asheville celebrities, right?
Yeah.
Ash famous podcasters. We have three with us today. Tony Ubertaccio from Making It in Nashville. And when you say that, you have to do the in Israel, they would call it rega. It means wait. So you say rega. In Italian, it's like, hey, bada bang, right? Ubertaccio from Making It in Nashville. Mm-hmm. We have Trey Scott from WatchPitch and Stephanie Kissel from Supportedly. Welcome, friends. Good to see you all.
Nice.
Good to be here. Thanks for
Good
having
to
us.
be here. Top of the morning to you. And, if you don't want to do the inner tube, consider like a stand-up paddleboard or a boat or a kayak or something. And I'll bet you Jeff has got an extra kayak there.
I do.
You do, right?
And I just got a dinghy.
Come on. And maybe you could do a podcast from the French Broad, like on the water.
Yeah. All right.
Come on.
Yeah, I like that.
Right?
It is called Talking Ship.
I just was going to go there. Exactly. You are fast. Yes.
He's good. That's why we hired her.
All right.
So I want to do a quick round the table. If you all could tell us a little bit, just a minute each of who are you? What's your business? Why do you podcast? Trey, let's start with you, man.
Yeah, sure. So WatchPitch is basically a platform and an app. Please visit the Apple App Store and download the WatchPitch app, and a YouTube channel and a podcast. And it's basically a way to connect early startup investors with early stage startups and entrepreneurs. A great way to tell a story very quickly and start a deal flow and a relationship in a matter of minutes instead of taking months and months of slogging through that effort. And podcasting to me was a great way to connect professional investors, professional startups, successful startups, and successful entrepreneurs in a way to encourage the audience of my users. And that's why the WatchPitch podcast was created, to basically expand the community. And we can talk about that more, but there's my intro.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Stephanie, why don't you go next?
Absolutely. I am Stephanie Kissel, co-founder of Supportedly. And Supportedly exists to help entrepreneurs connect to the low cost and free support that's available to them throughout the state of North Carolina. We offer lots of content, training, and then also are also a connectivity platform. With the Supportedly podcast, our initial goal in creating the podcast was to help highlight the support that's available to entrepreneurs across the state, but also provide perspective from the entrepreneurs who were participating in those support programs so that other entrepreneurs could hear from the entrepreneurs that had participated and get their take as well. So that was the initial take on the Supportedly podcast. We evolved it a little bit as our first season went on, and are currently in hiatus. And hopefully we'll have more news on that here shortly. But yeah, that's where we're at.
Great, thank you.
Thank
And
you.
Tony, why don't you round us out?
Sure. And I'm Tony with Making It in Asheville. Making It in Asheville started as a way to scratch our own itch. A little over 2 years ago, my wife and I moved to Asheville without a job and without connections. And we thought our backgrounds in marketing and content things would lead to something good. And so I think that podcasts, while they are certainly a saturated space, everyone's got their favorites, and there are people spending a lot of money producing very high quality content. If you niche down, there's an opportunity to make a meaningful impact. And the biggest impact that I've seen so far is just that we have, landed into a new community, and in 2 years have a proper community. Like, we have friends that have been past podcast guests, and we are connected, and we're fortunate enough to, be asked to participate on this. And that's just because we started a podcast a couple years ago and stuck to it.
So when you start a podcast like yours, Tony, was it like, what was the goals you and Sarah had in mind? Was it to, again, did you know you'd make friends and community just by interviewing people?
So I would love to say that it was a very well-structured and thought out master plan. I'll say that I am a optimist through and through. And so I thought, move in this direction and good things are bound to happen, right? It's one thing to ask someone for coffee. It's another thing to ask someone to be on your podcast. And so our goal was to put an episode out every week in 1 year. And that is a audacious, ridiculous, way bigger of a goal than we even thought it was. We knew it would be hard, but not necessarily how hard. And we got really close. Like, I think we did 50 episodes in the first year, or we took two weeks off theoretically. Mm-hmm. And 2 years in, we're at 100 episodes. And so all things 2.5 years in almost, we're at 100 episodes. And so while we've taken quarters off at a time, the goal was always just produce the episodes and attempt to do right by people so that there would be a reason to join. To say yes.
That's a really good point, if I might just jump in, because that consistency in terms of content and presence is always something that's going to add value to your ecosystem. I'm actually eager to hear from you, Jeff, about as you're kind of envisioning these next steps in the podcast cycling. I think one of the things that is absolutely important is to be in relationship with your listeners. Of course, that's why you're doing it, but so you want to add value to them, but you also want to give them some kind of predictability, some kind of through line or a theme. I found just breaking 50 plus episodes into seasons with a season focus, which is usually about 10 episodes, has been really helpful, so that when people discover you, they may discover you because of a specific guest. And this is the other thing that's great about guests, is that you leverage their community with your community. And now you've just at least 2x'd your listeners with that relationship, which is a huge, huge advantage. And, a guy with an app like me and a small startup, that kind of attention that you're generating, really, I'd see downloads increase. I'd see my footprint, expand to 5 continents, because people were starting with the podcast because of the topic being relevant to, in my case, startups and investors. Mm-hmm. And so I think whenever you're thinking about who your listeners are, and once you get in relationship with them, you want to reinforce that relationship with some guidelines as to who you are and what you're going to be and how you're going to add value to their day, whether it's a 15-minute show or an hour show. And I think that regular sort of delivery, I think is really helps to reinforce that relationship, because Tony, like you said, the podcast market is saturated. But interestingly enough, it's still working for everybody because there's a lot of diversity in listeners. And so there is a real opportunity for everybody to find their niche and to find their audience.
For sure.
Yeah.
And so was that a goal of yours, Trey, to get just massive exposure, global exposure for WatchPitch through the podcast?
Yeah. Well, yes. And the YouTube channel eventually, again, if you're going to record it, put a camera in the room and capture that. You've got another channel or another medium to communicate that to your listeners. And, WatchPitch was launched in Barcelona at the Mobile Tech Conference, and had partners in Israel already and in London. So those were both great startup communities for me to reinforce that international footprint. And I couldn't have done that and had that kind of exposure with a website, for goodness sake. This is an international technology that people can access, with a click and search. And there's no excuse, I don't think, for people if they want to connect with their users or their customers to not have some version of a podcast, or at least a way to connect with their users on multiple platforms of medium and experience. Yeah. And
That's great.
it's an easy get. I won't say it's free,
Right.
but it's still a worthy effort based on the ROI that I've seen.
Yeah. So Stephanie, you have a pretty different take on this though, right? Because your interviews are more evergreen content, interviewing and showcasing resource providers to help entrepreneurs. So it wasn't so much, I guess, about your exposure, but how do you raise the visibility of community partners? Is that fair to say?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, of course, anytime you start a podcast, there is an element of exposure for yourself or your organization, right? I mean, it is a marketing tool. Our goal, though, was, you're absolutely right, to create evergreen content that entrepreneurs can access anytime. And just as an example, NC Idea we interviewed them in a couple of interviews, and one of those was about their grants and writing for grants. And that's a podcast that we and they continually use when grant cycles open up, for education, as a means of educating individuals on what to do and what not to do when filling out the applications. So it really was a means of giving exposure to ESOs or entrepreneur support organizations throughout the state, but also a means of, allowing entrepreneurs access to information that really is as evergreen as possible. It's evergreen as long as the organization is around and doing what they're talking about doing.
So
that's I'm curious, just since if you don't mind, I'd love to ask the question,
please,
around this notion of evergreen content, because I think it's a stellar goal. It's an interesting goal in the startup ecosystem where things are so nimble, and Jeff being part of Venture Asheville and seeing how one of the verbs that as a startup and entrepreneur you have to be fairly fluent in is being flexible and being able to pivot and respond to market interests. So I'm curious, Stephanie, when you try to identify those evergreen topics, do you start with, something in-house that you feel is a topic that will be universal to everyone? Or are you identifying an NCIDA that's a great partner to consider because you've got those regular grant cycles, and that makes a good case for that being evergreen content? But I'm curious then, when you look at your other content, what are some of the other topics that are in fact evergreen? Yeah, that would be just interesting to me.
So the topics really are our guests, right? For our podcast, we're interviewing the leaders of entrepreneur support organizations, funders, and getting from them, their take on what their program provides to entrepreneurs, which in that essence, again, as long as the program is around, it's evergreen content.
I see.
And then 2, their take on how to participate, what it's like to participate in the program. And then also interviewing the entrepreneurs and bringing that second interview into the podcast, which we can talk about highly produced podcasts and what that is like, because that was the Supportedly podcast in that iteration was highly produced, by bringing in 2 separate interviews and editing those together. But having that take on from the entrepreneur's perspective, again, is a pretty evergreen take as long as that program is still around. And then we did start to transition to adding in a few just to mix it up, a few podcast interviews that were, as an example, I had, and just as a contrasting example a little bit, NC Idea, I interviewed Tom Root, who's the president and CEO, talking about specifically NC Idea, the organization, and the multiple programs that they offer, because they offer several programs throughout the state, not just the grant funding programs. And with that, they also offer, with the grant funding, I interviewed separately John Austin and got his take on specifically what it takes, what you should do, what you should look out for and not do when you're applying for their grants. And that also is super applicable to applying for any grants. There's a lot of content and information in that interview that entrepreneurs can use to ensure that they're doing things correctly there. So from that perspective, the content is evergreen as long as as long as the programs are still relevant and active.
Sure. And I in terms of content marketing, and evergreen's a great word. I think even if it's 90%, 80%, 75% true forever, and some of the details change over time, the one thing about podcasting versus, we'll call it blog posts, is that like a blog post, every quarter, every year, you can go in and update a URL. You can also do that with a podcast, but to your point, and something we might want to talk about, is like production on a podcast can quickly escalate to a level of what was I thinking? Why did we do it this way? The live read on an intro versus, plugging an intro in every time versus a custom intro every time. Those little decisions on structure add up to hours and hours and hours over the course of a season or year or years.
Yes. And I think sitting, between the three of us, I'm probably, for the Supportedly podcast, more on the spectrum of highly produced. We had a custom intro. We had a hook from the interview that we had to go in and select what's the hook for this episode. And then again, plugging in 2 different interviews into the episode as well. I was very lucky to have a support team and a production crew, like a post-production crew, that could take it and really learn to run with it.
Yeah.
So my time became more on just focusing on getting the interviews and executing the interviews. But man, to at the outset, it was a huge time commitment.
Yeah, we started in a similar way. We started with a soundbite, custom intro per episode, custom outro per episode, interview as the middle in the sandwich, the meat, as it were.
Yeah.
And you try and monetize, you throw an ad in the middle of that, like it adds up.
Yeah.
And if you have listened to recent episodes, we have stepped away from that structure, if only to lower the burden. I'm not saying that it's a better listening experience one way or another, but it lowers the production burden if you don't.
Yeah, and I think it's something that just to consider as far as building your podcast, what you want. It worked extremely well for our podcast, and we really love the product that we put out, and the end product is fantastic, and it's something we're still very proud of and love it. Would I also love to transition to less production? Absolutely. It's definitely puts a huge time constraint and can be a financial constraint as well, if assuming you're not the one doing all the work.
I think it's why it's taken us 3 years to get a podcast off the ground here.
Really?
Is needing someone like Julianne who can be our producer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Acquiring the equipment, scheduling. I mean, our first episode took a month and a half to schedule. Because our goal, right, is to facilitate conversations between interesting people around issues in entrepreneurship. And so we're going after really busy people, and that's for an hour of their time.
I'm very
but can I make it about me for a second? Does Venture Asheville need a podcast? Now that I've convinced my boss to buy all this equipment, like, do we even need a podcast?
Well, I want to ask you, what is your goal for the podcast?
Well,
you're getting snaps over here, and I think that is the question. The answer is a question.
my goals for the podcast, selfishly, are to elevate the Jeff Kaplan brand. As you all know, that's a burgeoning product for Ash famous people.
Event. Mhm.
So I'm trying to find any opportunity I can to get my face in front of a camera and my voice in a microphone. So this seemed like a good way to get paid to do that through Venture Asheville. Secondly, to tell the stories of our founders and showcase their expertise. So, Tony, I'm glad you mentioned ads. One of my dreams by the end of the season is to have a series of fake ads for companies and elevate our mentorship program. Like instead of hustling and trying to sell them, like we could do this anyways. Like we've got a portfolio of nearly 100 companies who've been through our programming that we can, have some fun with making ads for them, telling their stories. Again, but really, I say talking ship because we want to talk about issues in entrepreneurship. Like when I meet any of you individually or, over beers or coffee, we always like talk shop. It's not always about our business, right? Or your business or your buddy's business, but I think like Tony and I recently saw each other and we're talking about like crafting comedy, like as an art in itself, right? And just had a really great conversation about what makes a good joke and what makes a comedy stick. And we do that with entrepreneurship. I had another friend and I were talking about the future of development being more about applied versus developed technology and how it's going to affect tech jobs. Doesn't affect his or my business. Those are the kind of conversations that happen behind closed doors that are very inside baseball that we want to give a platform to. And that's our goal, my goal with the podcast.
So, and you were being honest about that sort of sequence of priorities. One, it's
I was
your
being
brand.
tongue in cheek about.
You were.
I've never met a microphone I didn't like.
Okay.
It's a true story.
No, but I mean, the reason I'm asking, because I do feel like it's worth being honest about that too, because somebody has to be hosting the show. There has to be some kind of brand, and if the brand is not Venture Asheville or not Asheville, but it's Jeff Kaplan as, lead runner and face and voice of Venture Asheville. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think it's important to keep it in the room if in fact that's one of the motivators, because, as you elevate your brand awareness, so goes Venture Asheville. And so goes the town of Asheville. This is you already have been a very functional ambassador for Asheville and for Venture Asheville and for the startup community. And this is a logical extension of that. But as a doing podcasting therapy, in this context, I think all the things that Tony and Stephanie brought up are absolutely accurate in terms of this is going to cost you money. This is going to take time. This is going to be an investment. And your ROI is kind of something that is a little negligible or at least hard to track. So, one of the pieces is, once again, to be conscious of wanting to add value to your listeners' lives at every step of the way and add value to your guests, so that when you're interviewing your Venture Asheville business leaders and founders and other people that are part of your ecosystem, that's one of the things that got people to come into the room and have the conversations with me, was that I was genuinely interested in giving them a platform to shine and to promote what it is that they were doing. And many of those people have started podcasts afterwards because, the experience was, hey, that was easy. I could do that. And all of a sudden, there's a new podcast.
Yeah.
That's great. Like, right? It is kind of contagious when you do these with other people.
I think it's easy to be a guest on a podcast, especially if there's a good host.
Yeah.
What I'll say as an answer to your specific question, Jeff, other than, well, what's the goal, is when I was sitting with it, I thought that the answer was, well, maybe. But I think that Jeff Kaplan should have a podcast. And I think that because Jeff Kaplan happens to be the director for Venture Asheville, it makes sense that Venture Asheville has a podcast. My wife and I are very different people. If she moved to Asheville on her own, she wouldn't have started a podcast. It wouldn't have made sense for her to start a podcast. Her energy, her communication style, her creative style is primarily written, sometimes photographs, sometimes like design thinking. I don't know what I think until I say it out loud. And so podcast is a good platform for me to communicate with humans. Theoretically, it would take me less time to say something meaningful in a conversation that's recorded than to write it down. I think that you and I are more similar than we are different. Therefore, I think that Venture Asheville, it does make sense to have some form of audio programming that is published regularly.
Cool.
You may proceed, Jeff.
So we should do so we shouldn't just end the call right now and pretend we never started this podcast.
This would just go in the archive.
Yeah, never published. Great conversation.
No,
Fun-
I mean,
fun chatting with you all.
yeah, I mean, definitely start with a commitment of,
Yeah.
a season and whatever that is,
Sure.
10 shows. And I don't know if you're going to release a bunch at a time, or if you're going to, do one as you do them. I mean, I think that's all something you feel your way, but just know that once you send it out, people are going to look to see if you have more.
Mhm.
And it's also championing this evergreen principle. You may find your listeners coming in through one of your guests 20 episodes down the road, but once they can then, those listeners can search through your topics and find out, oh, that's going to be a great one, or, oh, wow, he interviewed them. Oh, I want to click on that. So I mean, this is the whole thing. Welcome them into the ecosystem and know that every episode is an opportunity to do that. So being thoughtful about your ecosystem and what you want to offer is absolutely important.
Yeah, so I think Venture Asheville has two responsibilities to the ecosystem. One is to always increase accessibility and always keep, being more and more inclusive, making sure more and more people have the opportunity to find independence and empowerment through entrepreneurship, right? So this gives people another, entry point by building our funnel. And the other, I think, is almost like a PR agency, that we have a responsibility to tell the stories and share the stories of not just, our startup founders, but our resource providers and what makes Asheville a great place to move to or start a business.
Yeah. I think, Jeff, you'll have no problem with this, just knowing you.
Yeah.
But just for the listeners who are considering starting a podcast, knowing your why is very, very important going into it. And also being willing to evolve your format or evolve your podcast based on what your listenership is responding to. And that's, I have no doubt that you'll be very nimble with that, but it is, you may set your mind to a very specific format and then find that there are pieces of that your listenership is responding to, or types of episodes that they're responding to, and others that they're not. So I would just encourage anyone considering to start a podcast to be willing to revisit their format, revisit what they're doing for the sake of their listeners.
And I would love to yes and both Trey and Stephanie on something Trey said earlier was, throwing seasons out. It is a personal belief, and we have an example, but saying you'll do a season, arbitrary on its length, but having a season is important. So we showed up in Asheville, didn't know anybody. A lot harder theoretically for us to get guests than it is for Jeff Kaplan and co. So we threw a line in the sand, said that season 1 was over. We're going to do some retrospective episodes and fish for season 2 guests. And our season 2 guests were some of the best in terms of brand, some of the biggest brands in Asheville. And I think largely the reason why we got them is because we said we want to launch season 2 with an interview with you.
Nice.
And it was, it was 100% marketing, right? Why was it season 1? Why is it season 2? It's a conversation, and it worked. And so I think you'll have more than that, but having a why and allowing it to evolve, I think is so important. If you had interviewed us 2 weeks before we moved to Asheville, which is when the first episode came out, we said, it's a podcast about us trying to make it in Asheville. If you asked us today, the iterations, there have been 3 or 4, it's a story of people making it in Asheville to normalize the many ways there are to make it in Asheville. It is not about us. We are just a channel. We are a conduit for these stories to appear. And that is, to me, very different. And it's an example of Stephanie's point of the why was this other thing. It wasn't downloads. It was hopefully we get to meet people. Hopefully we get to hear some stories of how people, and we get to learn from it for our own benefit. And then it was all of a sudden it's there's so much more at stake, and it's only because we've continued to do it. If we had said we needed 10,000 downloads in season 1, we'd have stopped.
True. Hey, Jeff, the other piece too that I think you're in a unique position is that you are part of an organization, and one of the signs of a really visionary leader is that they're always thinking about their successor and wanting to prepare people to be a successor. So, if the podcast through the lens of and through the container of Venture Asheville is one that's championed for Venture Asheville, with you currently at the helm, sort of juicing this thing up into existence, but always reinforcing that brand of Venture Asheville. And this comes, to the place of the why. As long as Venture Asheville is clear about their why, and then the podcast is clear that they're in alignment with that why, then, it'll be impossible to fail. And you'll also be doing a service to your successor whenever that comes, to be able to also champion that. And there may be times when, maybe Jeff, you can't do the show, and now Julie's got to do the show, and no harm, no foul there, because you are the Venture Asheville show. And
that'd be cool.
Yeah,
that idea.
I mean, just think about that, and also to be able to go back and forth. That also helps your listeners identify that. Oh, I see. This is the Venture Asheville show. Yeah, Jeff's awesome. Julie's great, and but just life happens, and you may find yourselves wanting to kind of co-share, or at least again champion and answer that why in the context of Venture Asheville's mission and vision for the community.
So how do you guys find guests, and who do you choose to bring on your podcast? Like Tony, it was businesses you wanted to get to know, people you want to get to know. Stephanie, you had a more narrow scope of ESOs. Trey, you're looking at people who are doing the entrepreneurial work. But is it hard to find guests? Scheduling aside, do you have like a magic formula of how to get somebody on your show?
Let's go around, because I definitely have one, but I think it's important to.
Well, so when we first landed, I'd interview anyone that was willing to talk to me. So it was, one of our first guests was a guy named John, and we met him through a friend who I said we were going to Asheville, and on Instagram, and someone said, "Oh, my friend John lives in Asheville." John was our first guest. Gilly at Ware on College Street, right? Like we walked into Ware. Then Gilly and I had like a punt off, and I was like, "Hey, we're starting this podcast. Would you like to be on it?" She's like, "I guess," And so anyone that had a business was a guest, or got an ask from me early days. And we built into the podcast, especially early, was like, who do you think might be a good candidate for this podcast? And now we have a Excel spreadsheet that is entirely too large of references and people that we've been connected to or adjacent to, and then people who have like opted in, please interview me, PR agencies that are saying, please interview my client. And that, took a lot of time. And now we try to think about seasons as, can we get people that look different? Can we get businesses that look different? Can we get ages that are different? Can we get industries that are wildly different? And it's hard. And then you have to schedule it right. And then no one's family can get sick on the week, that you're supposed to record. And so it's an evolving process, but it's not perfect.
Tony, real quick, what was the tipping point for you guys where people started asking you to be on the podcast?
Mid-season 2. Once we published episodes with what I would consider two of the bigger brands in Asheville, East Fork and Highland Brewing, we were at a different level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for us, we did the same thing, Tony, as far as asking who else should we be interviewing? What other entrepreneurial support organization should we be interviewing? And we also then started to get that waterfall effect of ESOs, support providers, then emailing us introductions and saying, hey, I think you should you should have this individual on your show. I think they're doing great things, or they're launching a new program, et cetera. So that was from the perspective of the support providers. It really was a referral network, aside from just the ones that all of the support providers we knew. And we tried to, for our part, we tried to mix it up a little bit by industry. I keep coming back to NCID as an example. And then we also looked at support programs that have very specific goals, like Ventureprise in Charlotte has their customer discovery program that we really wanted to talk to them about. And of course, Jeff here in Asheville, we wanted to sit down and talk to him about where he's focusing and really give Asheville entrepreneurs an idea of the support that they can receive from Venture Asheville. The entrepreneurs always came, the second guest to our show, the entrepreneur always came from the support provider. So that was always selected by the support provider as someone who'd been really involved in the program, so they could give a good perspective of that program. And I will say, the one thing I do want to say for getting guests, we almost never had an issue. We had nervous guests, right, who were, I've never done this before, or, that sort of thing. And it really is on us as the interviewer to help calm their nerves and get them through the interview in a really great way and bring that energy to it. But if you do have someone that is reluctant to be on, don't have them on. Just move away from that interview. If you, at this point, you get to a point where you really don't have to, in this format, you shouldn't have to really beg people to be on the show. But if they're reluctant about your show, your format, and it's not, I'm not talking nerves here. I'm talking, more like they're just really not sure if they want to be on your show, then move on to the next invite.
Yeah, it's not a sales up. Even if it were a sale, you'd want to move on anyway, not an ideal customer.
Absolutely.
And I'm sorry, I just wanted to, at what point does that happen? So I said season 2, I realized that is not, it doesn't mean anything to anyone but me. So we were about 20 episodes in at that point, right? Season 1 had a lot more Sarah and I communicating with each other as fillers while we couldn't find guests at the time. Since then, it's been a lot of interviews, but it was about 20 episodes in, 18 episodes in was, I think, the start of season 2. So it's 20 weeks. It's almost, we're really close to halfway through a year, 4 or 5 months at that point of consistently publishing before anything even close to a tipping point happened. How long was it for you both?
For us, I think it was a little bit faster because we already had that network built up. We knew a lot of the individuals that we were talking to and had relationships with the organizations already. So for us, it was probably maybe 10 episodes in, but it happened, the ask for support and the, individuals reaching out to make introductions or just to make recommendations to us happened pretty quickly. But we, that's again, a totally different situation than what you were coming in with, Tony, because we were entirely, connected with the network already.
So I'm going to just make this really simple as an answer in terms of guests. And it's really based on the verb of your curiosity. Let your curiosity be the prime driver for the guests that come your way. In many cases, your curiosity to start a conversation with anybody is what actually is the fuel underneath having that conversation. So I would say for in your case, Jeff, who are you curious about? Because your curiosity is something that will absolutely fuel both the conversation that you have with that person. And honestly, I don't think I've ever missed on any of the podcasts, into my 5th season already, where the conversation hasn't been something that has enlightened me and as well simultaneously has enlightened the listeners. And so if you trust your curiosity to find your guests, and I'm sure, Tony and Stephanie, I'm sure this is what also sort of fueled the underpinnings of starting this thing in the first place. And I'm sure that if you're tracking your curiosity and you follow through with that invite, your show's going to be amazing and you'll have no problem discovering cool people doing cool things because you're curious about people doing cool things.
Yeah.
So that's the verb to have on. And if you're not curious, then let it go. It may come up again for that person. I mean, I think people know when they're being sold, content, and I think that's when you lose listeners. I think if you lead with your curiosity, you're going to get a loyal bunch of listeners, and they'll know that it's an authentic conversation and not one that's everybody knows what radio is. This isn't radio. Yeah.
My wife and I did a podcasting workshop right like days before the pandemic hit. It was, I think, February 2020. We had a little over a dozen people there, and the soundbite that we said, which was comparable to that, is if you're having a guest-driven podcast, the objective is to be interested, not interesting.
Good
That's
one.
Awesome. Yeah.
So you guys are all so successful. What are the biggest mistakes you've made podcasting?
Almost all technical.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, Tony.
I mean, I just every possible mistake. We did our first 30 episodes live. That's like 20 or so interviews were recorded live. We had a guest right before we started interview. She goes, "Oh wait, let me go to the bathroom." So I stop recording. Comes back. We do an intro without, and then Sarah looks over at me and looks at the recorder. And like eyes flash, and then I hit record, and the episode started. It was fine. We were able to make the intro make sense, jumping right into the conversation. But that's happened more times than I'm proud of. We have checklists, and it still happens. Everything on remote interviews that can go wrong has gone wrong. Bandwidth is never appropriate enough for a guest or for us. Neighbor plays loud music. You try and soundproof your room. It's not possible to make the bass not, hit. So it's like, what could have gone wrong has gone wrong, mostly.
Yeah. Same as far technical stuff. I was interviewing Nick Moen over at the Bright Angle, and in his studio, which was such a bad idea. And I've got, I can hear my heartbeat in these headphones that I'm wearing right now. They're so tight. So I had no idea that we were picking up all the noise in his studio, and they were trying to be quiet. But they had work to do. So I sent off. I was so proud of that interview. It went so well, and I sent that off to my producer Iris, and she was like, "Steph, there's nothing I can do with this." So that just and we re-recorded and got it out, but it was that was a mess. That was almost a missed deadline because of that. But
that was brave. That was brave. Yeah. I mean, just for context, Nick, runs a ceramic factory floor, where wheels are turning and things are coming out of a kiln, and they're shaving
power tools that.
Yeah.
I mean, just not ideal.
But I love that, because like that, early days, we would do these in-person interviews, and we'd call that like a NPR energy, right? Where like with just the right volume of crashing in the background, it's clear that this isn't in a studio, like we're interviewing live. And it's a very fine line. And so like gear is important, but what I'll say, asterisk, it should not be important enough to have you not start. And so Jeff, while I appreciate you, respect you, and love you, this, I would not let any listener go 3 years thinking that there should be a podcast and not start it because they quote unquote don't have the right gear.
Right.
Scale back the vision, get started.
Mm-hmm. As long as you don't sound like you're recording in your shower, which I have heard, and that's the podcast that I turn off. If you sound like you are standing in your shower recording, then I'm probably not going to listen to you. But if your audio, Tony, you're on your earbuds today and you sound great. I would listen to your podcast.
So let me show you the gear we got real quick. I'm going to pan my camera if I was watching this.
Shout out to the YouTube channel.
And this is called the Marantz Turret. It's an all-in-one mic, camera, light, mixer. Neat little thing.
I love that ring light too. That's fantastic.
Hey, why don't you can you turn that camera so we can see the ring light?
So I have a I love the depth of field that happens when you rotate. I have the poor man's version of that. I got a C clamp on a little stand and way better actual microphone podcasting setup for in person. Today didn't work. The neighbors at the office were making too much noise, so I ran home. And that's part of the gig. But love the turret. You don't need the turret to get started.
No,
it's
I have a podcast.
Right.
My setup is a pretty inexpensive mic. I stole these headphones from my husband. My dog ate this at one point, the mic stand. I still use it. But I have a podcast in a bag setup, and I have two mics. Cool. I have two mic stands, and that's what we run with.
And when you show up, people are like, "Whoa, this is so professional!" Oh, yeah. And they're like, "Yeah, watch out, I'm super professional." At least that was me.
I will say as a cautionary note that one of the things that is worth putting out there as a yellow flag is just under budgeting what this actually takes, because it does take capital, not a lot. Don't get obsessed about equipment. You can get some amazing results with very little investment. But also under budgeting your time and your commitment to it. We're all running our businesses. We know this is a part of it. I don't know much, Tony, I'm sorry, about your ecosystem, in terms of your business, but I do know that, if this is a portion of your life and you're also running a business and having to, acquire clients and all those other things, a podcast is a complement and most certainly should be a driver for your business. But it is a trade-off because you're not doing something else. And so that's something definitely to budget. And this is why I think committing to a season, whatever that is, pick a number and commit to that length of time so that then you have a way to look back and debrief and go, okay, how valuable was this? Like, most certainly it fed your soul because this was important to do for you.
Or it didn't, right? Or you realize, that was the realization.
Exactly. Or it didn't, and it was like, I can let this go because it is an effort to create content. And make no mistake about it, it's not, you just don't add water, you do need to think thoughtfully about it. So committing to a certain amount of time and then looking back and doing an assessment. And this is something that entrepreneurs do all the time, and sometimes on a week, and most certainly on a weekly basis. So that's just something to add into the mix when going, should we have a podcast? Should I do this? Because everybody that's going to come into your studio, Jeff, is going to be thinking, oh, this is a really good idea. How did you do this? And then you'll get the 20 questions and you'll want to help them. But I think as a cautionary note, being clear about budgeting your time and the expense is important.
So speaking of time, I want to thank you all for spending so much time with us. I wanted to stop at the top of the hour to not go over and respect you all, how busy you all are. Yeah. Before I let you all go, can you just do a quick plug again, who you are, your name, what your business is, and the name of your podcast so people can follow up with you?
So go ahead, Stephanie.
Okay, well, I'll go. Hi, I'm Stephanie Kissel, co-founder of Supportedly, and you can find myself and my podcast, the Supportedly Podcast, on supportedly.com.
And I am Trey Scott, founder of WatchPitch. You can find WatchPitch on your YouTube channel search on any podcast. We're on 17 different platforms at the moment internationally. So just do a search for WatchPitch. Visit the Apple Store, download the app. It's free for the 2 weeks and send in a pitch. We have investors checking deals every day.
And I just want to say at 55 minutes in, that was the first time anyone talked over each other meaningfully. That was incredible. So that's one of the variables to keep in mind when you're doing a multiple person podcast, is that there is a fine balancing act on when to speak, and you can't be in the other people's brains. And oftentimes there are traffic jams. And so congratulations us for making it this far and not having many. So this is Tony Ubertaccio, co-founder of Making It in Asheville. You can find that podcast everywhere you listen to podcasts. I think recently we were at 16, maybe 18 total platforms. Hard to say, but I love that, Trey, you knew.
Yeah.
Find it anywhere you listen to podcasts. The website is Making It in Asheville. That is a passion project for us at this point. We love meeting people, telling stories, and would love to be a resource to anyone who, especially locally, is interested in starting their own podcast. We have a bunch of documents that we put together over the last 2 years on best practices.
Thank you guys so much. Good seeing you. Hope to see you all in person soon.
Likewise. Bravo.
All right, well, Juliana, we're going to stick around for a minute and do a little more wrap-up banter.
Yes, we
If
are.
you all want to stick around, you're welcome to. Otherwise, you can sign off.
All right.
So,
Congratulations,
Yeah.
Hey, Venture Asheville. I think that this was a fun first episode. And am I right to say, Jeff, were you on all 3 of our podcasts? Trey, did you do a bit on
Oh,
I've
yeah.
done all 3 of your podcasts.
Look at that.
I
That's why I
know.
invited you all.
See? The big circle. It's a big circle.
It is.
All right. Take care.
Juliana,
Thanks,
great to meet
guys.
you.
All right,
We'll
thanks,
see you
y'all.
soon. All right, so banter. That was a great episode on podcasting.
Yeah, I
From
learned a lot.
podcasters. Those are very accomplished podcasters too.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, especially now that we've had our own, mess ups already, it's nice to know that these very experienced people who are doing great podcasts, awesome podcasts, have also made some mistakes. And we've got a lot to learn, and we're gonna adapt, and we're gonna do this.
I feel like you're beating yourself up over this technical issue we had this week. They shouldn't be so hard on yourself.
Well, it's a little bit at the top of my mind, but this was the perfect conversation to have with these people.
Yeah.
And comforting and genuine people. So I really enjoyed that.
And they all did seasons. Should we do seasons?
That's
Give
what I
us-
was thinking.
That was an objective and keep it time bound so it's more measurable.
Yeah. Say we're gonna do a season. It can be 8 episodes. It could be 10. It could be 12. It could be 100.
And just speaking of numbers, Trey said he was on 17 platforms. How many platforms should we be on?
Let's go to the moon with it.
To the moon. All right. We'll try to be everywhere you can find a podcast. That's where we'll be. Awesome.
You want to plug Venture Asheville?
I think I did in the beginning, but I guess
You
I
did?
should
You want to do it again?
Venture Asheville is the high-growth startup initiative of the Economic Development Coalition for Asheville-Buncombe County. We build entrepreneurs and get startups funded through our 3 core initiatives: mentorship, financing, and events. If you're interested in learning more about the startup scene here in Asheville, please visit ventureasheville.com.
All right. Perfect. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, we'll see you next time. Bye.